My case study is on invasive mussels in the Great Lakes. In 1989, the city of Monroe, Michigan, which is on the shores of Lake Erie, was without water for 2 days due to a clogged intake pipe. They get their water from Lake Erie. And this pipe clogged, and so the whole city was out of water for 2 days. And a few months later, the nuclear power plant that is near Monroe and also on the shores of Lake Erie was shut down temporarily, also because of clogged pipes. So what was causing both of these incidents? Zebra and quagga mussels. These are two species of mussels that are native to Eastern Europe. They are very, very small, but they colonize quickly. They're prolific breeders, and they build up on surfaces, just kind of build on top of each other. Zebra mussels first arrived in North America, and they were believed in the mid-'80s, but they were first identified specifically as zebra mussels in 1996 in Lake St. Clair. And this is a species of mussel that attaches to hard substrates and can be found in pretty high densities. But then a few years later, quagga mussels showed up, and these actually outcompete zebra mussels. They can live in deeper waters, they're more tolerant of cold, and they don't require a hard substrate to attach to in the same way that zebra mussels do. And they can actually be found in densities of over 7,000 mussels per square meter. So they just like build up like crazy, and that's what was causing these clogged pipes. These mussels are in each of the Great Lakes except Superior. It's because from what I understand, Lake Superior doesn't have the calcium levels that are required for these mussel species. And so as you can see, they have really taken over. In Lake Michigan, quaggas now make up 97.7% of the mussels in the lake. And they cause a lot of problems. They are filterers, so they eat a lot of phytoplankton, which changes food webs and which affects the fishing industry as well. The biomass of prey fish has drastically decreased in Lake Michigan and all of the lakes over the last 30 years. And they also, because of the filtering effect, they create clearer waters, which increases plant growth, which, as we talked about in class, decreases dissolved oxygen, leads to eutrophication. And this leads to problems like bird die-offs because of botulism outbreaks. Rotting plant matter washes onto shore, and beaches will just be covered in this rotting plant material. It affects humans as well. Beaches become less usable, both because of the rotting plants on the beaches and also because these shells from the mussels wash to shore, and they're very sharp. They cut feet if you walk on them barefoot, so people can't walk barefoot on some beaches now. And this is a photo from a beach on Lake Michigan. I don't remember which one off the top of my head, but it's just covered in these mussels, so you have to wear some sort of shoe or sandal to be able to walk on that beach safely now. And they also cause lots of damage to boats and docks. But the real focus of this study was that they clog intake structures for municipal water systems and power plants. And this is not a problem that was unique to Monroe, Michigan. There are many, many, many cities on the Great Lakes that draw their drinking water from the lakes, and also power plants and other industrial complexes that use water from the lakes. And so it's estimated that over $500 million a year is spent on cleaning mussels from structures so that they don't clog pipes. And it's estimated that about $2 billion a year is added to the cost of producing electricity and producing drinking water in the Great Lakes region because of these mussels. So some of the root causes, the first is business. The way that the mussels first got into the United States is through the St. Lawrence Seaway. So the St. Lawrence River, which you can see here, it is the way water flows out of the lakes and into the Atlantic Ocean. And so in the 50s, the Seaway was completed. It was basically a canal and lock system that allows international ships to have access to the Great Lakes. And the way that these ships brought in the species is through their ballast tanks. So these large ships have what are called ballast tanks in the hulls. They're empty when the ship is loaded with cargo, but when the cargo is unloaded, these tanks are filled with water and it makes the ships more stable. And so you would have ships in Eastern Europe, for example, loaded down with cargo, heading for the Great Lakes, and their ballast tanks may be quote unquote empty, but there's probably still several hundred gallons of water with an unspecified number of freshwater species in that water. And so when the ships make it to the Great Lakes, their cargo is unloaded, the ballast tanks are opened to fill with water, and those species can escape. And so it's pretty well known that this is how invasive species get into the Great Lakes. Shipping industry officials acknowledge it, but they have been reluctant to install ballast cleaning systems, partly because of policy, which I'll talk about next. Just without clear policy in place, they don't know what kind of systems to put in, and so they're not willing to spend the money to put in these cleaning systems without clear guidelines. So, as I said, the next root cause is policy. The US and Canada built the Seaway together, and but they have not been able to come together to form a clear policy about regulating incoming ships, especially when it comes to ballast flushing. When the Clean Water Act was passed in the 60s, the EPA actually gave an exemption to the shipping industry to not require ballast flushing. I think it was something to do with they didn't want to put that on the Coast Guard to have to monitor that. And so many hundreds of invasive species have been able to find their way into the Great Lakes because of this issue. Policymakers have failed to listen to warnings from scientists. There were people warning about the possibility of zebra mussels invading the Great Lakes since the late 1800s. It had already happened in Western Europe and had caused lots of problems there. And so scientists in the United States were talking about wanting to prevent this from happening to the Great Lakes, especially as a canal was being proposed. And then another root cause is the ecology of the lakes themselves. Niagara Falls is kind of acted as a barrier to the upper four Great Lakes, which are Superior, Huron, Michigan, and Erie. Just like the topography of the lakes themselves, an invasive species could theoretically swim its way up the St. Lawrence River and into Lake Ontario, but the falls were really a pretty strong barrier against any species getting into the upper lakes. And so because of this, the upper four lakes were really protected. There was no kind of immune system against invasive species because it wasn't an issue until the St. Lawrence Seaway opened. And so there are also no native predators for these mussels. There is the goby fish is a predator, and it is also from Eastern Europe, and it is also now in the Great Lakes. So there is a predator in the Great Lakes, but it's also invasive. It also causes problems. So the Niagara Falls acting as a barrier has actually made kind of the problem worse in a way. And then when the Seaway was built, the language that was used around it was finishing the job of nature. One of the reasons they wanted to build the Seaway is to provide business and wealth to these Great Lakes ports. This promise of, becoming these world-class port cities were given by policymakers to try to sell the idea of the St. Lawrence Seaway to people in the Great Lakes region. So when the Seaway opened, there was this quote from Walter Cronkite about reshaping the continent and completing the job of nature, kind of this imperative of humans to fix the problem that Niagara Falls was this barrier. And then also there is the issue that with a lot of invasive species, especially with mussels, it's hard to see the issue. Most people have no idea that it's a problem. And so it's hard to deal with a problem that you can't see. So some solutions. The first solution is to recognize that there is no solution to the mussels already in the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are huge. There are a lot of mussels in them. They are the reality now, that it's just the way it is. And so there's kind of this emphasis in the Great Lakes of just kind of dealing with what is and having this new normal. But steps can be taken to stop the spread of mussels to other areas. One area that is of particular concern is the Columbia River Basin. This is a map that shows where mussel species have been found, I think in 2017. So as of then, and I think still maybe now, the Columbia River Basin has not had these mussels been brought in, but that is of particular concern. So some business solutions are that the seaway could be closed to international ships at Montreal. The reality is that the seaway was not built large enough, and so it was almost immediately too small for many of the newest huge freighters. And most of the traffic on the Great Lakes is ships that stay in the Great Lakes. Only about 5% of the traffic is from international ships. So they could close the seaway to international ships and require all cargo to be unloaded at Montreal and then transported by train. I've read that this would probably not actually cost any more than the damages from a potential new invasive species. A policy solution short of closing the seaway would be more stringent rules for cleaning ballast tanks to prevent new invasive species from entering. There could also be stronger policies nationwide for stopping the spread via private boats. I know that a lot of states in the western United States especially have pretty strict rules about boats being brought into their lakes. They have to be cleaned and dried and all of these things before they can enter the lakes. They're still spreading. And so more stringent national policies would be helpful. There are a couple of instances of small lakes being cleaned of mussels. There is this product called EarthTech QZ that has been used in a Pennsylvania quarry. It's ionic copper and it poisons the mussels. It would have to undergo more testing before it's used widespread, but it could only really be used on small lakes and on lakes that have been pretty recently infested. And then divers are also used to clean structures, but even lakes have been cleaned in this way. Lake George in New York, they responded pretty quickly to the discovery of mussels in that lake. I believe they started cleaning just a month or two after they found the first mussels. And they were able to actually eradicate mussels from that lake using only scuba divers cleaning. No chemicals were used. But it took a lot of man hours, and without volunteers, it wouldn't have been possible probably because it would have been so cost prohibitive because of all of the time that was spent doing that. But this shows that there are ways that small lakes especially can be protected and be quote unquote saved from the mussels. And then in the philosophy theology department, there is this Creation Care Alliance that I came across. They're not working with mussels specifically, but I thought they had an interesting idea. They do these eco-grief meetings where they bring people together to kind of deal with the grief of ecological degradation. And one thing I noticed as I was doing research is that a lot of people who work in the Great Lakes, scientists and biologists, fisheries experts, they have like these really deep connections to the lakes, and there seems to be this undercurrent of grief about what is happening to the Great Lakes and the ways that they've changed drastically over the last few decades. And so the thing that this Creation Care Alliance does is they hold these eco-grief meetings as a way for people to kind of face their grief and deal with their emotions so that they can be spurred on to action. And so I thought that was an interesting way of dealing with this emotional challenge that is the Great Lakes mussels problem. And I am out of time, and so